सीधे चलते हैं तीन मूर्ति भवन, जहां वित्त मंत्री अरुण जेटली भारत की आजादी के 70 साल और मोदी सरकार के 3.5 साल पूरे होने पर आयोजित किए गए एक समारोह को संबोधित कर रहे हैं।
Thank Anirban for having continued this debate year after year and bringing out this annual publication which reflects a very strong point of view. Vivek and Ashok Malik have jointly edited the book and they deserve to be complimented. I have the privilege of knowing both of them, and I was asking Vivek that temperamentally they are so different. How did they put it together? And Vivek's candid reply was they just had to write the introduction. And therefore that was not a very difficult job. Swapn was emphatic in making a point about there being several issues even outside the economy, particularly in relation to how India is emerging at 70. I've said this a few days earlier at another function last Sunday, and if I may briefly make the point that there is a new ideological divergence which is now emerging in India, which conventionally in the last 70 years wasn't there. And the last 3.5 years particularly have seen this happening very emphatically. In a democracy, ideological polarizations will always take place. And I can see across the country a new ideological polarization taking place in terms of both acting in tandem and on several issues taking a stand in convergence amongst the ultra-left in India and the extreme jihadi elements across the country. And therefore the alternative ideological pole to the one that we represent is now converging around this particular thought. And this is quite evident. Their electoral base is very narrow. And therefore, if they were to contest elections, probably winning seats would be extremely difficult, if not nearly impossible. But if we look at areas, particularly university campuses, media, some writers, some civil society activists, this voice is becoming more audible. Now, those who traditionally occupied the centrist space have virtually abandoned that space. And on most issues have actually become cheerleaders of this thought which seems to be emerging. And one can see this in several political controversies which take place. Now, as an alternative pole to this, that traditional classification of who is the left, who is the right, I think this labeling in India will get diluted. And therefore, the pole that I represent in terms of ideological position naturally becomes and has the responsibility, not only having replaced the Congress party as the center stage on Indian politics, but also then becomes a natural protector of the state. And therefore, whether it is issues relating to national security, you'll find repeated evidences of this coming. And the best evidence, when this whole polarization process started about 2 to 3 years ago, I had then said in Parliament, and I had asked my friends in the Congress party, if Mrs. Gandhi or Rajiv was your Prime Minister or your leader, would you have gone in support of the slogans at the JNU? My understanding is certainly not. But it is this shift which has taken place and the abandonment of the centrist position by them. And therefore, whether it's the policy on Kashmir, or how to deal with Maoism, how to diffuse a crisis like Doklam, how to marginalize Pakistan on the international stage, how to create a situation which in the last 6 months has been created in the Kashmir Valley, where after a long time, the separatists are actually getting exposed before their own people. And I think this space naturally does now come to us. On the economy, the space of bringing a blend between a fast-moving economy, an economy which grows, and making sure that the benefits percolate even to the poor, and therefore getting all cross-sections on your side and arousing a new confidence in them, has been the basic tenor of this government in the past 3.5 years. Now, if you look at, and I'm not drawing comparisons in relation to what this country has undergone, if you look at the capacity of the leadership to take decisions, does the leadership shiver, make excuses for want of consensus, and then refrain from taking decisions? Does it push a country into an era of policy paralysis? Does it look the other way when gross cases of corruption take place in the country? Or does it have the capacity to lay down a particular agenda and then implement the agenda? The irony really is that when we started this whole process in the first 1 or 2 years, the favorite comment was, amongst those who were unable to reconcile, these are incremental changes. There is no big bang. Post demonetization, post GST, in fact, the biggest criticism that I faced on GST is, why did you do it so quickly? You should have delayed it a little more. So in contradistinction to a policy paralysis regime where decisions were not possible, passage of law was not possible, enforcing action itself was not possible, the entire tenor of the debate and the comment itself altered itself. Now, obviously, one of the priorities before this country was an economic discipline and prudence, but at the same time, you had to bring a balance and also do the necessary spending. Not an easy job, but in terms of fiscal prudence, and whether it was bringing down inflation from a 9-10% level, and look at the change in the tenor of the debate. You inherit a 9, 10, 11%, and at 3.36%, the peak periods are normally monsoon. The debate on the whole base of the debate has changed. Is 3.36 also inflationary? Of course, a system does need some inflation. Otherwise, it would be completely in a recession mode. And therefore, you controlled the macroeconomic parameters. No hidden deficits in the budget. You brought the fiscal deficits down. You tried and brought the current account deficits down. You tried to maintain the rupee at its appropriate value, and then comments for the first time started that is it stronger than what it should be, because then the comment was it is hurting some section of the economy, namely exports. And having done that, what were the kind of decisions which political leadership in the past at time would think twice before taking? I think the kind of integration with the global economy we brought about by opening up the economy step by step. We not only opened up several sectors, we made the entry smoother, and we eventually found that 95% of all investment coming into India was coming by the automatic route. And therefore, was the FIPB necessary at all? Because it was only duplication of the permissions itself. We then, if you draw from your memory, how all files for environmental clearance used to travel to Chennai. And that regime had to end. And I'm glad it ended. And therefore, permissions became relatively easier. Crowds around North Block, South Block disappeared. And then slowly, in each sector which needed to be changed, and let us just examine how political corruption in New Delhi has been tackled. The genesis of the New Delhi corruption was discretions. And because you had discretions, and because you also have discretions accompanied by a non-transparent political funding mechanism, so this led to exercise of discretions for collateral purposes. So in the first year itself, the Prime Minister laid down an agenda and said, allocation of resources, discretions, just eliminate them. And therefore, let the market mechanism decide. And we've been much better off. And therefore, small areas which paralyzed at least UPA 2 because of this discretions being used and misused, we were completely able to distance ourselves from these discretions itself. Then came the bigger challenges. I've already announced this year, and I'm keen to implement it. It's in the final stages. How do we legitimize the political funding in India so that the underground funding itself comes to an end? and an alternate mechanism is set in. The Prime Minister had a very strong agenda on creating a new normal as far as India's shadow economy was concerned. It had actually corrupted us as a society. It had tarnished our image globally. There was no way in India you could do business without relying on the alternative mechanisms of payment. Properties had to be bought in two colors of money. Many businesses had to maintain parallel books of accounts. And therefore, something which the UPA didn't do since 2011, the first decision, we accepted the SIT. We gave an opportunity to people to come out clean on assets illegally held abroad. We brought a strong legislation against that. We started entering into various transactions through G20 and other bilateral transactions with countries so that information in real time comes. We've started prosecuting people whose assets were found abroad. The Benami law was a typical case where the law was originally passed in 1988 by Rajiv Gandhi. The law ministry said it can't be implemented, rules can't be framed. So it remained on paper. So I got it approved by Parliament, put it into action, and this whole business of shell companies and rotating money through these shell companies. And it's not merely businesses. We've also started with politicians who did it. And the color of politicians doing it defies their political ideology. And therefore, the strong action being taken under the Benami law against these transactions is sending its own signals. Since 1996, we were trying to renegotiate Mauritius, Cyprus, Singapore. When the economy was more vulnerable, we had entered into these dual taxation treaties. And now, of course, we didn't need this money. Most of it was round-tripping. So last year, we renegotiated all three of them. And then came this very strong action on the demonetization itself. Now, if somebody had closely watched the government, from financial inclusion to insisting on bank accounts, downwards, each one of those actions, and then the entire effort is to subvert a debate as though the demonetization was synonymous with confiscation of currency. Well, demonetization was intended to make sure that this anonymous tender which operates in the market gets identified to its owner. So when it gets identified to its owner by way of a compulsory deposit into the banks, the money doesn't change colors. Those who can't account for it will have to pay the necessary taxes for it. And the object, because those who criticized it, the shadow economy of black money continuing under that old normal, and changing that old normal was never a part of their political agenda. And therefore they started singing virtues of cash itself. So the whole object was, you end that anonymity, identify it with the owner, expand the tax base, certainly of the personal income tax base, for digitization, expand the footprints. The transactions doubled in a matter of days. slipped a little and are now moving up. And then for the future, make sure that the process it has started where the high denominational currency already stands compressed, this process of compression goes on. And I think it successfully moved in that direction. Well, people saw that riots would begin, starvation would take place, and this became one of the smoothest possible replacements of currency itself. On the GST, it was everybody's call that a single tax comes. And I must confess that even when some leaders of the Congress party made critical statements, I have to be more than fair to their state governments and their finance ministers who knew the merits of what was happening. And therefore, on top, if I look at it today, the decision-making mechanism in India's first federal institution itself has institutionalized itself. I have the numbers on my side, but I have never put anything to vote in the 21 meetings which last 8 to 10 hours each. We work out consensus. The legislations are by consensus. The rates are by consensus. All steps are by consensus. There is a grievance redressal, very powerful mechanism. We meet regularly. And then those who had pushed this country into a policy paralysis, when they saw it coming, said, please postpone it. And I must say, to the credit of at least 2 of the Congress finance ministers of the states, who walked up to me in the GST Council, and one of them said, sir, please don't blink. If you do, it will get derailed indefinitely. And then what do we get? We are now just finished the second month. So as a base year of 2015-16, we have to give 2 hike-ups of 14% each to the states. And for both the months, with some part of the compensation cess, we are well within that figure. I at least never imagined that for the states we'll reach the break-even point in the first 2-3 months itself. And therefore, one does expect some teething problems to come up, particularly the lowering of the compliance burden as far as the small sector is concerned, small and medium sector is concerned. We've been having continuous meetings how to do it, and probably we will do it. But the whole process has been put into action. And the likelihood of revenues is almost reaching, in the initial months, the anticipated figure. And therefore, as we'll walk down the next couple of months, we probably will move up. Before coming for today's meeting, I just checked up. Even the direct tax figures, as of today, are 15.7% over and above last year. So this so-called slowdown, which some visualize, hasn't impacted that. And of course, as I mentioned, the GST itself, because the only relaxation which we are making is 95% of the GST revenue comes from only 4 lakh assessees. The balance over 6 million pay only 5%. And these 6 million take their own time because of compliance burdens and they slowly keep filing it. And that's something which we'll have to live with even in normal taxation. It's nothing very significant. How do you then invest? What has this led to? And when you speak in terms of Modi 3.5, when we took over, the first 17 highway contracts didn't attract a single bidder. And the reason was very clear, that we had almost bankrupted everybody who was in the business of building highways. And today you are back at 20 plus kilometers a day. This year you are close to 4 lakh crores of the union budget as far as infrastructure is concerned. Today I took a meeting of the public sector undertakings. This year their capital expenditure is another 3 lakhs, which is outside the union budget. The FDI coming into the country continues to be the largest ever. I don't recollect the first 3 years of this government emerging from a policy paralysis. After all, growth rates are relatable to several factors. One of the factors is how are you fitting into the world? Is the world supportive, or is the global economy stopping you from growing? There was a period from 2003 to 2008 where we grew with the global trend. And then the world slowed down. But we became the fastest growing economy for the first 3 years, the major economy. And of course, in economies, you will continue to face challenges. We've had great challenges in the past also. 1991, the middle of 1991, today we have over 400 billion of foreign reserves. What was the foreign reserve left? Less than 4 billion. So those successful men who managed the affairs in 1991, we were left with less than 4 billion. Mr. Vajpayee's government, if you look at 1998 to 2002, the NPA figure was a staggering 15%, 14%, 12%. And how did it get tackled? The RBI then radically brought down the rates. And when the interest rates had come down, the value of the G-Secs had gone up, and therefore, and this was coupled with the first important legislation that the government brought, the securitization law, Sarfazi as we call it. And a combination of these factors then brought the whole figure down. What are the challenges that I see? I, of course, see an important challenge that after having gone through the effect of demonetization and had its advantages, some impact in the slowdown, but a positive long-term impact, some impact in the short term, but a positive medium-term and long-term impact. And this 15.7% increase in direct taxes I've just mentioned is really because the personal income tax base is expanding. All those people who deposited money in the banks have now to account for them. And the effect is, and today the challenge really is, that during the boom period 2003 to 2008-9, our private sector expanded. Global economy slowed down. They had expanded beyond a point. They had undertaken large liabilities from banks. they didn't find a demand. Global commodity prices went down, and many of them have found their loans unserviceable. And then came a situation, 2012 to 14, where the government had virtually given up. There was no policy initiative, there was no step to be taken. You allowed things to drift on their own. And when you allowed things to drift on their own, the figure mounted up. And I must say that those in the government, those in the banking industry, those in the central bank, the Reserve Bank, when reckless lending took place, were all looking the other way. And then suddenly, some harsh steps were required. So the debate is, are those steps which have been taken a bit too harsh? Particularly the steps with regard, the bankers believe that the steps with regard to excessive provisioning are a bit too hard on them. And therefore the private sector investment itself is one area where we have not grown. Several areas of private sector have grown. There are many industries which have invested. I've been speaking to a large number of them. I just mentioned the CPSUs itself this year will have a 3 lakh crore capital expenditure. The large industry has been borrowing more from the bond market than from the banks itself in many cases. And therefore that's a problem which has today to be addressed squarely by us. And we are in the process of doing that. I can assure you that the indifference in dealing with that problem when it was taking place, and then during the period 2012 to 14, of just looking the other way, really hasn't solved, is not going to be the approach of this government. There may be challenging solutions to this, but when the leadership of the government is more decisive and is willing itself to take steps, I think it's a situation which I'm sure we'll be able to respond to appropriately. I must say that India at 70 is an India which we look up to, where we want to continue to occupy that place of a fast-growing economy. And if you look at the nature of expenditure, it's not merely infrastructure that I mentioned. Each scheme of this government, which is addressed to the poor, and therefore blending this with the needs for providing a better quality of life to them. So you are perceiving of each village to be connected by road by 2019, each village to be electrified by the beginning of next year, and then within each village, each house to get the electricity connection. And you have a time bound till 2018 end to reach that. One of your more successful programs is to make sure that every poor house has a toilet. You have for urban and rural housing one of the largest programs which is available. Each house has to have a cooking gas connection, for the poor even subsidized. And therefore each one of your schemes, a bank account of each home, a direct transfer of cash into those bank accounts, and these are literally hundreds of millions of bank accounts now. So they have some money in those bank accounts. You incentivize them with the very low cost insurance policies, and therefore you blend you continue to expand on your food program and in your work program in rural areas, we are spending actually more, even though some of those programs were initiated by the previous government, because the resource availability is larger. And therefore, the entire advantage of an additional resource which comes out of growth is then blended with the needs of these sections of society. This is how India at 70 is what we visualize. Obviously, when India is at 70, there are always attempts to change the narrative itself. And I must confess that I do not have the luxury as yet of being a former finance minister. Nor do I have the luxury of being a former finance minister who's turned a columnist. And therefore, I can conveniently forget a policy paralysis. I can conveniently forget the 15% NPAs of 1998-2002. I can conveniently forget the 4 billion reserve left in 1991. And I can switch over and change a narrative. I recollect in 1999 when I first entered Parliament, probably on the first or the second days, there was a major controversy involving an issue related to the Bofors case, and the government asked me to speak. I had joined as a minister. I became an MP a few months later. So after I finished my speech, our senior leader, Mr. Advani, who was sitting next to me, he congratulated me and emotionally held my hand and made a very interesting comment which I have repeated in the past. And he said, when you speak in Parliament or outside, speak on issues, avoid speaking on persons. I then, of course, I may have breached this rule once in a while, but I tried to follow it as far as possible. Now, I have some very distinguished predecessors in my present job, one of whom is a former president, one is a former prime minister. And I'm certainly not referring to them. The others have decided to act in concert. Because speaking on persons and then bypassing the issues is something which is very easily done. So I did my little research today. Only to just bring out 4 or 5 sentences, if you'll bear with me. One said of the other, Chidambaram will have to be born again to match my record as a finance minister. He then linked Finance Minister Chidambaram to an incompetent doctor for failing to curb India's alarming fiscal deficit. And then he went on. And he said, I accuse him of running the economy down to the ground. He then said that Chidambaram is the most conceited person He then went on to accuse him of bugging his phones. Today, with complete responsibility, I want to say, when I raised the issue of Aircel Maxis, Chidambaram ordered my phones to be bugged. The other one was not to be left behind. And he said, I thought Shri Sinha would be happy to remain a distant memory for the people of India. However, since he seems determined to remain relevant in his party, I am obliged to recall his record during his 4 years as finance minister. I may point out that in 2000, 2001 and 2002, 2003 were the worst years since liberalization in terms of growth, and Prime Minister Vajpayee had then to force him out and replace him. Well, I'm glad they didn't have Mr. Advani to advise them. But then acting in tandem itself won't change the facts. Probably a more appropriate title for your book would have been India at 70, Modi at 3.5, and a job applicant at 80. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, you heard Finance Minister Arun Jaitley at book release, India at 70 and Modi at 3.5, effectively answering his critics, two of whom he named at the end of his address, while quoting from what they had written or said about each other themselves, both former Finance Ministers Yashwant Sinha and Chidambaram. The Finance Minister spoke extensively and clearly sketched out how the entire job when he took over was to revive the economy, which was stuck in policy paralysis. Inflation was very high. He said that we tackled that right away. At the same time, we acted against the corrupt and targeted black money. And then we've come to a situation where you have one of the highest forex reserves that India has ever had. It's an all-time high. The level of FDI is at an all-time high. He said that the only worrisome factor that he sees is that private investment, their capex is not picking up, and he's saying that the government is working at addressing that as well. He said this is not a government that will be left in indecision and inaction. This government has always taken tough decisions, and it will take them as and when necessary. So there's a clear indication there that the Finance Minister is planning something to further answer his critics, although he did say that the economy is not in as bad a position as it's being made out. The economy is robust. Several agencies, international agencies, are also saying that, and the FM is saying that he will keep doing his job because that's the responsibility that he's been given by the people and the Prime Minister. We'll keep getting you all the latest right here on DD News. Do stay tuned.